Wherever two or three are gathered, there's potential for conflict. Is that how that verse goes? Okay, not quite. But is our reality even at camp? So in this episode, Jake sits down with Amber Hill Anderson, who is a camp enthusiast, mediator, and conflict resolution specialist. So they're going to talk about some strategies and some methods to manage conflict at camp this summer. As the summer comes up, we know that there is potential for disconnect sometimes between staff or between campers. And so they're going to talk through some specific ideas specific to camp about how to make connections, build bridges, and manage potential conflict this summer at camp. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, where we dive deep into theology, research, and practical wisdom for camps, retreat centers, and other key ministry spaces. I'm your host, Jared Rendell, camp enthusiast and part of the Sacred Playgrounds team. This podcast features Dr. Jake Sorensen, a scholar and practitioner who's helping leaders think more deeply about outdoor ministry and the impact it's making. Wonder with us what God might have in store at your sacred playground.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. It's good to have you with us. We have a very special guest. Actually, she's not a guest. She's one of us. She's been with Sacred Playgrounds for a number of years, and I'm so excited to be talking with Amber Hill Anderson about a topic that she really knows a lot about. It made a lot of sense to have her on today. So, Amber, it is so good to see you. How are you doing today?
Great, Jake. I'm so excited to be here and excited to always talk about camp.
Absolutely. We sometimes get on the telephone and we just talk about camp for hours. We sometimes can't even go on the telephone because we take so much time. We have to text each other. Kind of funny the way that works.
Yeah.
So if we go a little long today, it's just because we like talking to each other and about camp. So, Amber, not everybody knows you. So give us a brief synopsis. Who are you? What's your connection to camp?
Yeah, so I had the great fortune to work at camp all throughout the summers in college. So I worked at Sky Ranch for 2 years, and maybe at like 2 1/4, I showed up for a brief period in my last summer of college. I think unbeknownst to my camp director, to be honest, but he was gracious enough to let me stay. And then after college, I worked for a summer at WAPO and Lake Wapagasset, and I was always running the ropes courses when I was at camp. And I loved it. Like, it was a really deep and impactful time of my life. It's, shaped who I am, and it shaped my career. So I'm really grateful for those experiences and times.
So in the ropes courses, you were always dealing with the emotions and the potential conflicts and just the anxiety. So that was an interest of yours right from the beginning.
Yeah, it was a heightened point for campers during their week. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to work with campers out of their element and to foster that collaborative time and that like I said, heightened experience, kind of the mountaintop experience that then fed into other greater conversations and other greater experiences with the campers.
So what are you up to now?
Well, now I am a mediator in Colorado. I've been doing that about 5 years. And I focus on civil, county, and district cases. So that can be anything from neighbor to neighbor disputes, family dispute, debt, all those types of different cases. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at the University of Denver. I teach conflict resolution, negotiation, and research. So depending on the quarter, that's the class that I'm teaching.
So grateful to have your expertise with us today to talk about this important topic. So Amber, give us a sense of what a mediator's role is. Like, what do you do? Where do you fit in with, maybe the legal process, or when somebody has a conflict, how does that come to you?
So in Colorado, a mediator is a neutral third party who works with the parties to find solutions. And often the way that I get cases is the court will order mediation for participants prior to them being able to go to litigation. So the attempt is for parties to first come to a solution on their own, prior to seeking the ruling of a judge. And very often it's successful. So very often parties are able to find a solution on their own with the help of a mediator so that they can avoid the cost and expense and the time that litigation requires. And so that's where I show up.
This is amazing. I mean, such important work as we think about how, I mean, sue happy the society has become. I'm going to sue you for this, or I'm going to come after you legally for this. Anytime there's a dispute, and sometimes a dispute between loved ones. I imagine. I mean, I've certainly seen that in some of my friends and family members when there's been something like a divorce or something like that, and it gets really, really ugly. But it's not just in family disputes. I mean, I've just been seeing so much in our society today about bullying and conflict and people getting really mean to each other. Can you give us some insight into what's going on there and what you're seeing, from your perspective?
Yeah, my sense is that we've gotten away from an understanding of the spectrum of possibility when it comes to conflict. There's lots of ways to resolve it. And at least when I talk with people, often what I hear is I either have to roll over or I have to litigate. And there's not a good understanding of the spectrum of possibility in there. And luckily, often the court will understand that. And that's why mediation gets ordered. So it's one of the options on a menu of ways to address conflict effectively. And so sometimes litigation really does make sense. Truly, I'm not, anti-litigation in every case. But even prior to filing a case, or like what you're talking about with bullying, when it's a lower level dispute, it can still be consequential and important for people. And what I think has been lost that I work really hard to reinstill in people is that sense of like, there are options out there. Think through all the options critically and with some time and space before moving forward so that there's the best possible outcome.
Sure. So, I mean, young people usually aren't going to sue one another, but they
Right.
are experiencing conflict that we do need to help them work through. And so, what do you see happening, among young people, children, young adults, in terms of, is this problem getting worse? It feels like it's getting worse. And we've talked about some statistics in previous episodes where, statistics say it's getting worse. So again, what are you seeing in terms of the youth and young adults?
So I have a colleague who described our current climate as increasingly spicy, which I think is a good characterization. Tensions are higher, people feel stressed, sometimes attacked, and sometimes for good reason, right? I think there's not a good understanding of nuance all the time. And that can be a little bit, nebulous to state. But I think social media exacerbates problems. Social interactions are decreasing, especially with the pandemic. And so there's some social skills that would usually be just part of everyday life that has really been put on the back burner, in the last couple of years, just due to the public health crisis. So it's a lot of all or nothing thinking that is present. That seems very addressable to me. I think there's a lot that can be mitigated and a lot that can be addressed well. Understanding, of course, there are those extreme cases, and I'm not necessarily talking about those, but there's a lot in there. Like you said, youth aren't probably going to sue each other, but there can still be a consequential conflict, and there can still be an actionable, real solution that works for everyone. Method, I think, is what's getting lost. So again,
Oh,
the method of
yeah.
addressing conflict.
Well, help us out with this. I mean, because I love the analogy of spiciness,
Mhm.
because some people can't handle any, and some people just thrive on it. They want to go as spicy as you can get, and so they're actually looking for some of this conflict, and so there's such a challenge here of dealing with different personalities and different people. But talk to us about method. So how do we start? What are some of the things we can do to avoid some of these conflicts?
Well, William Ury talks about going to the balcony, which is a really useful strategy. And by that, he means take some time and space away so that you can survey the landscape. And I think that is really helpful. Again, we're very reactive, we're really in the moment. And that's it might feel good to have the zinger in the moment, and it very rarely is helpful in the long term. Um, so I would recommend first people go to the balcony and take a look at the landscape to see, what is possible. Because in the balcony, you can see more than, in the moment. And so there might be options that you hadn't considered. And so when I talk about the spectrum for addressing conflict, there's of course direct negotiation, person to person. And then there's mediation, where it's still direct person to person, but with a third party neutral to help facilitate the conversation. In the legal world, there's then arbitration. So that would be, like a private judge, essentially, who hears out the different parties and then makes a decision for them. And that decision is binding. Depending on the organization, this wouldn't apply so much for youth, but in general, for the adults listening in, there's also ombuds. So ombuds can be an internal dispute resolution practitioner who is outside the hierarchy of the organization, and they can provide recommendations, but they're not an enforcing body. And then, of course, there's the nuclear option, and I think it should remain the nuclear option, is litigation. So that would be, formal, high cost, and then a judge makes a decision whether you're happy with that decision or not.
Right. That's the place you don't want to go if you can avoid it at all. And,
Right.
I just, even as you're talking through these options, I think of the biblical connections to this. When Jesus talks about, settling disputes, first go to the person and talk to them about these disputes. And then if you can't resolve it, bring another witness or two and try to work through it. And then if that doesn't work, bring it to the whole church.
Yeah.
So kind of that sort of escalation in terms of, sometimes you can handle it one-on-one. Sometimes you need another brother or sister in Christ to work through it with you. And that's where kind of this mediation is that you're talking about. So in terms of method, you say, go to the balcony. I love that. You're getting fresh air. You're getting a new perspective, right? You see things from a different angle, a little bit of time to breathe deeply. What else can we do in terms of method here?
I think also, not that I would edit the Bible, but I would add that whoever you bring in needs to be thought through as, is that person welcoming for the other person as well?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think the tendency to like bring in buddies and to show like what a strong backing you have, that's going to put the other person on the defense right away. Because think about it, if the tables are turned and that happens to you, and suddenly you've got this group in front of you telling you, the conflict that you caused, it's going to put you on the defense automatically. So being a critical thinker and being thoughtful about the other side, which is hard to do in the moment and is hard to do when tensions are flared, but having the right people in the room can really be important for the recipe of success, we'll call it, since we're talking about spicy things. So who is involved really matters. And so if, you may have the best friend who makes you feel good and who, is totally behind you 100%, but that best friend may not actually be the best person to bring with you into the conflict when addressing the other person, especially if that other person doesn't have the same relationship with your best friend.
Oh, that's so helpful. You're not trying to gang up. I mean, because that would be the tendency, right? To find somebody who takes my side, and then we can be 2-on-1. This is all really helpful. So let's do this. Let's take a quick break, and then what I want to do with you, because you have so much insight into relationships at camp and with these understandings of conflict resolution, let's get really practical and talk about camp, because summer is coming. Staff training is right around the corner. Campers are going to be here for some camps, in about a month from the time that we're doing this recording. And so these things can be really helpful for our summer staff and for our program directors. So let's take a quick break. We'll come back and we'll get really specific about camp.
Hey camp friends, Sacred Playgrounds has a brand new resource designed just for your summer staff. It's called Holy Ground, a guide for summer camp staff. At its core is a daily devotional that accompanies your staff through the summer, from the intensity of staff training to the exciting early weeks of programming, on through the challenges of midsummer, and then the bittersweet exhaustion of those closing weeks. The devotion includes wisdom and reflections from dozens of current and former summer staff from multiple Christian traditions. We'll also help staff make the transition from summer camp back to their home and school environments. Alongside these devotions are pages devoted to some of the most pressing issues facing your summer staff, including how to address tough questions and doubt, interpreting the Bible at camp, addressing mental health challenges, and key findings about the camp experience from the research at Sacred Playgrounds. Order by May 1st to get your copies in time for staff training. This resource is available at sacredplaygrounds.com.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. We're talking with Amber Hill Anderson about conflict resolution. We're going to get really specific now and talk about camp. So we've been talking about it in general, but let's talk about how we can apply some of these things at camp.
So at camp, you have the benefit where it's probably going to be more in person than life outside of camp, which is wonderful. So what good practice for campers and what good practice for staff to be direct with each other and to go to the person in person to find some solutions. So it's become an underutilized method for conflict resolution of just going to the person in person and skipping the electronic means. With electronics, you lose tone, you lose context. I had a friend who, she was outside of camp, but she was in a dispute with a business, and she received an email that started off, "Dear ma'am," and she was irate. Now, this is a lovely, rational, just wonderful human being who, in any other circumstance, "Dear ma'am" would have been like a non-issue. And she's venting to me about this "Dear ma'am" email. And I said, I love you. I think you got to let that one go. On the spectrum, you got to pick your battles, and that's probably not going to be one that's winnable when they're using professional voice with you,
This is so fun. I can totally relate to this. Like I sometimes don't think, and I just kind of write my emails or something, and somebody takes offense, and I'm like, wait, what happened? And sometimes I'm really trying to be careful with the wording and picking something like, okay, what do I say? And like, "Dear ma'am," it's like, oh yeah, I might have done that, at some point. It's just, you never know how things are going to be taken when you do them impersonally like that.
Yeah. And you don't get to pick the context of the other person who's reading it electronically. So that's part of the benefit of I know there's a lot of conflict avoidance currently in our society. I think people feel like it's too aggressive to be direct, but there's lots of ways to approach people that aren't an attack. And in person, especially with good timing for both you and the other person, can really be helpful, even if it's, it feels scary in the moment. It really can be helpful for finding a solution to avoid that escalation, to talk with the person directly and to get to the bottom of it before things get, more heated. I think that's gotten lost, that ability to be in person. So at camp, we get to exercise that.
That's one of the things we highlight about the benefits of camp. You can't just unfriend a person. You can't just, walk away. Like, you have to deal with it. And so, this is awesome. So at camp, we have that part built in, going to the person, or at least the person is right there for you. What else about camp?
So I think there can be some conflict prevention as well, that especially since staff are just about to get started. Ask early what those avenues for conflict resolution within the organization may be. So whether it's the hierarchy of the camp, who's boss. I know I didn't always show up and ask those questions. And then, when suddenly I needed to know the answer, it became a little more awkward to go find out, well, who is that person's boss in case this does have to escalate. So there's probably some type of process that leadership will be employing when conflicts do arise. So getting to know those things first while things are good can be really effective just, in mitigating any future conflict. And then again, finding that time and space with your colleague when it's a staff to staff conflict, finding a space in private first, which can be a huge challenge at camp, right? It's a jam-packed schedule. There's not a lot of private space. There's not a lot of personal space. But I think, trying to find those moments can be really helpful and possibly away from campers if it really is a staff to staff member conflict is helpful, because you don't want an audience and you don't want to bring in more people that aren't involved and, have this glam on effect. That's not helpful for anyone. So
Sure. Makes sense. So you mentioned the staff to staff conflict. I mean, I can kind of imagine two different types of conflict, right? I mean, you could have a conflict with another staff member or have to work on mediating a conflict between two staff members, or it could be a conflict among campers. And so do you see these things as similar, different? I mean, how different are those, in terms of conflict resolution?
yeah, I think again, the options are different with staff to staff conflict. I one time had a conflict with a colleague when I was working at camp who I really respect, still to this day, still respect and enjoy, but they had not followed a safety rule that I had set. And so, obviously I was upset. I chose not to react in the moment in front of campers. And because we were lateral colleagues, like we're on the same level, I went to our joint supervisor and said, "Hey, this happened. What do you recommend?" And so that supervisor and I brainstormed. Um, I was very lucky. He was also very lovely. And he said, "Well, try this first." He actually recommended, go talk to him first. If that doesn't go well, come back, and we'll address it together in a different format. And I said, "Great." So I went and found my colleague, pulled him out of his cabin at a time that worked for him because there was another staff member to watch his campers, and basically said, the safety rules are there for the camper's safety and for our safety. I understand you don't agree with it, and I'm glad that nothing bad happened today, but the expectation is that will be followed in the future. And that was essentially it. He heard me, he apologized, and again, because he's a lovely human. And the rest of the summer went fine. But my concern was, having not addressed it, then every time we were back working out with each other and on the ropes, that I would have to be concerned that he would break the safety rule. And that just wasn't a concern because we addressed it promptly. So in a sense, I guess I was very lucky to have a receptive audience. And I was also very lucky to have not only a strategy, but also a follow-up strategy in case, that initial conversation hadn't gone well.
This is helpful too. I mean, as we think about, how easy it is to just kind of let things slide, oh, like you said, oh, he's a lovely human. He didn't really mean this. But no, it's got to be addressed now. And so addressing it promptly, I think, is great advice for these summer staff members who, again, they don't want to damage relationships or cause a scene. But it is important to not let these things fester.
Yeah, there seems to be this myth that by avoiding it, it'll go away. And not that, never happens, but I think it happens less than we realize, or, it might fester. If I had stayed stuck in concern that I wasn't going to be listened to when on the ropes course, like that would be a conflict for the rest of the summer, whether or not, we're yelling at each other in the moment or not. And so I was able to move on and do my job well because we were able to nip it in the bud.
Awesome. Thanks. Are there other suggestions that you have in terms of like the staff to staff conflict?
Yeah, I think another thing that I, remember is a lot of venting. And like, not that venting is harmful, but again, picking your person and being thoughtful of who that person is for the other person that you have a conflict with. And then not staying stuck in venting. So, with venting, also start strategizing. And if you're that person being vented to, start strategizing with that person. They do need to feel heard and they do need to, probably get something off their chest, but only to the degree that then there is action at the end of it to find that solution. So venting for venting's sake can be really problematic. And that's what I would encourage people to think about, if either the ventor or the ventee, to, once kind of the smoke is cleared, start thinking about what's practical, what's actionable, what's next.
That makes good sense too. I mean, sometimes we need to vent. And so, like, if I have that much frustration inside of me that, like, I mean, sometimes I'm so upset with somebody that it's not going to be helpful for me to go to that person in that moment. And so is that where the balcony comes in? Or how do I, like, where do I, if I need to blow off some steam before I go to the person, how do I do that and still make sure it's in person?
Yeah, 100%. I think, recognizing when the venting has occurred, right? So, and it might be you have to do something physical in the meantime too, or singing, or I know people have all sorts of ways to blow off steam. So understanding what that thing might be for you and doing that before having the direct conversation. So I think we've all experienced that person who, they vent to person A, person B, person C, person D. And great, each person, because they're camp people, is a willing ear. But at some point, it does have to stop, right? Like vent, great, and then move on to the next step, or encourage your colleague to move on to the next step.
Awesome. So that's staff. So you said that, I mean, it seems like it would be different for campers. So what kind of suggestions do you have as these staff members prepare for the summer for dealing with person-to-person conflict among campers?
Yeah, I think staff know this, but I just want to reiterate the obvious that whatever you do to model and how you address the conflict is what the campers are going to remember. Campers are going to remember how you make them feel, not necessarily if you had the exact right word choice. And so model what it is you would want your campers to do the week after they leave camp or the month after they leave camp, because they will remember you. And if you don't think you're a model for your campers, all due respect, you're wrong. I don't need to know your camper to know that you are definitely a model for them and they're looking up to you. So I would encourage people to think about, okay, in my ideal world, how would this be addressed? And then model that for the campers. So that can be, remaining as the calm presence in the midst of conflict. It can be, de-escalation, talking softly, addressing it in person. All those different pieces can be really helpful. Hearing people out, hearing your camper out, can be really helpful for addressing the conflict in the moment and showing your camper effective conflict resolution strategies.
Awesome. So what are some of those? What are some of those strategies then when I'm there and I've got my campers and they have a conflict? I mean, so there's an argument that goes on. So obviously we don't want to avoid it, just like with staff. We want to address it. What are some of my first steps then?
First it's safety, right? Just because we know bullying actually happens. Like if there's a safety issue is always first. Make sure your campers are safe. First physically, and then you can work on the emotionally and intellectual safety later. But first, make sure everyone is safe, because you're not going to get anywhere until that's addressed, irregardless. And then it's often sitting down with the campers and talking it out and hearing both sides and having both sides hear the other. So creating that space where there is that listening is really powerful. And I think, again, it's a tool that we're losing that is undervalued, where each person shares their perspective, each person shares their experience in front of the other person so that they hear it and so that they understand, even if they don't agree, what the other person is experiencing. So that, that's kind of mediation 101 of each listening to each other and then problem solving together from there.
That is incredibly helpful. That space, that safe space to hear. I mean, so that's what the mediator is doing, creating that space, helping them find that space together. This is great. So we're going to the balcony, get a new perspective, take some time away, blow off the steam first if you need to, and then addressing the person in person. I love that. Something we always do at camp, but making sure that we don't just let it fester. So we're going to address the problem promptly, whether it's between staff or whether it's between campers. And then I love how you emphasized that staff members are a model for the campers, and how we treat them, how we handle conflict is incredibly important as we show them how to navigate these things. Because we're not just showing them at camp and trying to make sure we have a good rest of the week. We're trying to make sure they have a good rest of their life, and that they gather some of these life skills so that they learn how to work through these challenges rather than just closing in on themselves or unfriending the person or running away.
Right. There's no anonymous at camp.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. you're unmasked in so many different ways at camp. And that can be so uncomfortable for people. And in that space of uncomfortability, sometimes these conflicts arise.
Yeah.
And then creating that space to listen and hear, and making sure that they are able to hear one another. That can be a challenging thing, to set up a space like that.
And I think staff don't always recognize the value in in their listening skills. So listening to your camper is a powerful experience for your camper. I can still remember when my counselors would listen to me when I was a camper as a kid, and it was a powerful moment. Here's someone who I just totally idolize. I just think they're rad, and then they care to stop and listen to what I have to say. It's powerful. And your camper's not going to turn to you saying that was powerful, Counselor Amber or Counselor Jake. But it is a lasting impact that you can have with your camper, to listen, to validate them, to make sure that they understand that you heard them. Even if you're not all powerful and able to, solve all the problems, the act of listening, again, I think is really undervalued.
That's ministry, being there with the person fully, being present with them. So important at camp. Amber, thank you so much for these insights. Did we miss something? Are there other things that you want to tell the summer staff and the program directors and directors that are listening to this as we approach the summer?
Well, have a wonderful summer. I'm very excited to, see the photos and hear the stories. I know it's going to be wonderful. And I think, again, as we're starting off the camp summer, have those conversations now about the expectations when conflict arise. So if you're the leadership, making it clear what the avenues are for different types of conflict with your staff as they're fresh and they're excited and they're listening to you. It's a great opportunity to make those venues clear. And so then when things do happen, things can get addressed appropriately and responsibly.
Awesome. This is great. Making sure that it's explicit. It happens in training. It's written down. What do we do with a camper-camper conflict? What do we do when there's a conflict between camper and staff, between two staff members, between a staff member and a leadership staff member, or even between a staff member and the director? Making sure that everybody knows where these avenues are, so that we can address them promptly, and we don't just gloss over them and say, "Oh, it's no big deal," because it could become a big deal real quickly. And that safety one on the high ropes course was a great example, because we think it involves physical safety when somebody is not respecting the other person, or there's a conflict in a situation like that. And there are, of course, other dangerous situations in our camps when we're out in the wilderness or canoeing or all these different things up in the mountains. So really helpful.
Yeah, returning staff are going to have some hysterical stories on ways that they break stuff up. So tap those stories. That's a wealth of information that I'm sure your colleagues will have in terms of, what they did when campers got too heated, or, when whatever went down. Those are excellent people to tap within the context that you're working. Ask those stories early so that you have some ideas and some tools in your tool belt before anything actually is happening. I think that's a good way to show up with confidence, and then a good way to show up with ideas for addressing things well.
Awesome. You heard it here, folks. Here's your homework. Start to address these things right now. Plan on how you're going to do this in staff training, making sure that everybody's prepared, knowing to whom they're going in terms of conflict, and setting up these important parameters of going to the balcony, addressing things in person, not letting things fester, and creating that safe space to hear the other and to really listen to the other that camp already provides, but you need to provide as well as a mediator in these circumstances. This is awesome. Thank you so much, Amber, for being with us. This is a big topic, a big issue that people are dealing with right now. They've noticed it so much at camp, especially last summer, that the incidents were on the rise. And getting in front of it this summer is going to be incredibly important. So thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, this is fun. Thanks, Jake.
We'll see you next time on the Sacred Playgrounds podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. This episode was produced by me, Jared Rendell, and featured Dr. Jake Sorensen, lead researcher and founder at Sacred Playgrounds, LLC. Our theme music was written and performed by Taylor Wilson. You can find his original songs wherever you get your music. Learn more and connect with the Sacred Playgrounds team at sacredplaygrounds.com.